So let's move on to talking about security topics specific to a WebLogic domain. So every domain has at least one security realm, and usually one security realm is all that you need. You can configure multiple realms. However, I think one is really all that you need. So a security realm contains mechanisms for protecting WebLogic resources. So within a security realm, we can define security providers, users, groups, roles, and policies. And all of these are used to secure WebLogic resources, whether it's an application or a data source or a JMS server. This is essentially the security infrastructure for protecting those resources. So in order for a user to access a WebLogic resource, that user must be defined in the security realm. When a user attempts to access a resource, WebLogic will try to authenticate and authorize that user by checking the role assigned to that user in the security realm and the security policy that is protecting that WebLogic resource. And we'll cover security roles and policies here in just a minute. So what's to talk about users? Users are users. There's not much here to talk about, but a user is authenticated against the security realm. Within a security realm, we can define different types of authentication providers, and users can be in the embedded LDAP that comes with WebLogic. They can be in a database, or they can come from an LDAP store. So when a user wants access to WebLogic, they must provide some sort of identity, such as a username and password or a digital certificate to WebLogic. If WebLogic can verify the identity of that user based on that credential, and then WebLogic will attempt to authorize that user to determine whether or not that user has access to a WebLogic resource. And that's typically done through a security policy, which identifies who or what has access to which resources. So a user can be a person, a client application, or another WebLogic server. And really, since a user is simply an entity that's defined in a credential store such as LDAP or a database, it could really be anything. So once a user has logged into an application or authenticated against WebLogic, it is assigned an identity. And this identity, internal to WebLogic, is called a principal. And application developers make use of this principal to determine what groups or roles that user is a part of. So when a user authenticates, WebLogic will gather all its group membership and role information and package that into this principal and provide that to the application. And once that principal has been given to the application can then use that principal to determine whether or not that user has access to certain resources within the application. And of course, users can be associated with groups or roles. And we'll get into groups and roles in just a second here. So there's nothing complicated about groups. These are just like operating system groups. They're a set of users. You can have groups based on a variety of things, like by function or department or geographic region. And it's certainly easier to manage groups than users. If you've got 1,000 users, it's easier to manage the 2 or 3 groups that they may be members of rather than 1,000 users. So if I have an application that has many, many different users, and I want to grant access to that application, I certainly wouldn't want to do it on a user by user level. I would want to allow the group to have access to the application and then just manage membership of that group if I need to disallow or allow access by a particular user. So WebLogic security roles are a privilege that's granted to users or groups. An example of a role might be there's a deployer role within WebLogic that determines who can deploy an application and when. So roles within WebLogic are dynamic, and what that means is that you as an administrator define conditions that determine what that security role looks like. And so by conditions, for example, I mean you can determine which groups are part of that role, or you can define roles based off of time of day. Let's say that you wanted to allow only a certain group of users to have access to perform certain functions during a certain time of day. Let's say you only want to allow your third shift administrators to have access to start up and shut down the WebLogic domains. You can define that as a role within WebLogic. So when you create a group within WebLogic, that group is scoped to the entire domain. And what I mean by scoping to the entire domain is that that group is available to any application or any resource. It is visible at the domain level. Now, a role can be scoped to an application or a resource or resources within an application. So on their own, roles don't protect resources. In order to protect a WebLogic resource or an application resource, we must create a WebLogic security policy. So a policy is simply an association between a resource, such as an application or a URL or a data source, and a user, group, or role. Now, as I mentioned earlier, best practice states that we don't manage security at the user level. We manage at the group or role level and then manage membership within that group or role. So typically you'll see in production environments, in most environments, that policies associate a resource with a group or a role. And like a role, we can define conditions on that policy. And those conditions define how and when that policy is enforced. So the security realm contains what's called security providers. Security providers provide authentication, authorization, identity assertion, password validation, and auditing services within a WebLogic domain. And since Java EE application security is managed by the WebLogic container, the container uses these security providers that are defined within the security realm to provide that security. So WebLogic comes with several out-of-the-box default security providers. However, you can purchase third-party security providers, or you can develop your own security providers. So there is an API to develop your own. However, in most cases, you wouldn't need to do that unless you have very special requirements. If you are using a database or an LDAP for storing your security information and your users, then most of the time the default security providers will meet your needs. So WebLogic defines these types of security providers. There are authentication security providers, which we'll go over in the lab. The authentication provider provides the authentication service for your domain and your application. There's the default authentication provider, which relies on the embedded LDAP within WebLogic. There's a SQL authenticator, which allows you to use any database that supports SQL as a data store, as an authentication store, or an identity store. And there's also an LDAP authenticator, which uses, as you can imagine, an LDAP server. There are product-specific providers as well. So within Oracle, there's Oracle Internet Directory and Oracle Unified Directory and Oracle Access Manager. And there are authentication providers for each one of those if those products are in your architecture. And there's some other ones here like identity assertion, which asserts that you are who you say you are. Principal validation, authorization. Authorization asks the question, do you have access to this resource? Whereas authentication asks, are you who you say you are? Whereas authentication and identity assertion ask you to identify yourself and to assert that you are who you say you are. And then there's adjudication. So if you have multiple providers of the same type and there's a conflict in those providers working together, let's say you had two authorization providers and one authorization provider authorizes user, but the other authorization provider denied access for that user, you can write an adjudication provider that will serve as the tiebreaker to determine who really has access. So that's one role, the adjudication provider. Then there's other providers that are less common, but certainly useful: role mapping, credential mapping, and certificate lookup and validation. As I mentioned earlier, there's also an auditing provider. So in this lesson in lab, we're really only going to focus on the authentication and auditing providers. So in WebLogic, there's a security provider database. The database contains the users, groups, security roles, and policies and credentials used by some of the security providers. So for example, an authorization provider requires information about security policies, and an authentication provider requires information about users and groups. So the security provider needs this information to be able to function properly. and it gets this information from the security database. So you can see in this diagram that we have two types of resources. We've got default resources, default groups, roles, and policies, and we have defined resources. So default groups, roles, and policies are what come with WebLogic out of the box, and then there are the ones that you define in your environment. And this diagram shows where those are stored and how they're accessed. So we can see here that default groups, roles, and policies and defined users groups and roles are stored in the security provider database. Whereas scoped roles and policies, so roles and policies that are scoped to a resource, are stored within WebLogic itself. So when you define a user or a group or role, it is going to be stored in that security provider database. So by default, WebLogic uses the embedded LDAP server as its security provider database. And Oracle states that it is production quality and it's recommended to support users up to 10,000. Anything larger than that, then you may want to look at using a database-backed security store. Now, typically, if you've got several thousand users, you're not going to be using the embedded LDAP server. Typically, you would already have a directory service or a database for storing those users anyway. And so you can use that database. So if you've got an external store like LDAP or a database server, you can still use the embedded LDAP server regardless of the number of users that you have. However, WebLogic does support using a database for that security store. So that's it for this lesson on WebLogic security. We've touched on securing your WebLogic environment at a very high level. We've talked about operating system. We've talked about networking. We've talked about securing your WebLogic installation and your WebLogic domain pre and post creation, as well as talked about some security fundamentals, resource security fundamentals, such as users, groups, roles, and policies. So in lesson number 9, you'll learn how to secure WebLogic resources using some of the topics that we went over in this lesson.